Welcome to Darshan Talks, powered by the Kulkarni Law Firm. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm here with Jeffrey DiFrancesco. Jeff and I have known each other for several years at this point. He's actually been a guest on the show before. I'm really excited because we had a conversation last time around regarding sort of just an overall perspective on mergers and acquisitions, and we decided to do this a little bit more organized. And we actually decided to get into the depths of it. We started talking a little bit about how you actually begin identifying the right target if you are a possible buyer. And Jeff was kind enough to go in and actually do a little bit of research to find out what would make a company a possible ideal target, if you will. And he looked at some of the publicly traded companies. So looking at some of those issues, we're going to let Jeff sort of take it from here. But before we get started, Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself?
Name is Jeff DiFrancesco, and I have about 20 plus years in advising pharmaceutical, life science, and healthcare technology companies. And specifically what we do at Advancer is we provide context around mergers and acquisitions. We also focus with companies in terms of post-acquisitions to make sure that their intentions are successful. And we have expertise both in terms of advanced analytics, organizational design, as well as significant financial and business acumen. And so we work with both early stage companies as well as much larger public companies.
So Jeff, you actually bringing a lot of experience to this conversation, so I appreciate that. So let's start a little bit from your thought process of an acquirer. When you're having these initial introductory calls, what are you generally seeing in terms of VCs or private equity companies? Does it change? Does it matter who they are? And how do you help them narrow down the angles, narrow down what they're looking for?
Great question. Well, let's take a step back in terms of a lot of the more recent changes that have taken place, and what are some of those some of those trends. So one of them is the whole idea of digital health and telemedicine. So that's a whole category. So if you are looking at it from a private equity or a VC perspective, what they're looking at is what are some of the prospective emerging trends that are taking place, either new sectors that are being established or high growth disruptive types of technologies that can be employed within more mature markets. And so digital health and telemedicine is clearly one of those areas. Another area is data analytics and AI. So that's something clearly it's very hot, but it's really just accelerating. It's always existed. The application on clinical decision support systems, the use of real world data, trying to create real world evidence. This is something that has been around for probably over a decade, but it's only start to shift as a function of new regulatory changes, as well as acceptance of these technologies at a commercial scale. Another area is in terms of just general consolidation within healthcare provider sectors. And that's something that is no different in other industries. You're going to start to see only 2 or 3 predominant healthcare providers in every geography. And there's going to be one exception to that, and that is what we discussed in the beginning, which is the whole digital health and telemedicine. And we'll go over some examples, case studies, specifically, how this is essentially going around those traditional geographic constraints through telemedicine and other types of digital health technologies. Another area is the value-based care model. Health, we all recognize that it's not sustainable in terms of the current pay per service model, and value-based care is really being accelerated both by new companies entering the marketplace, but also the healthcare insurers are really starting to demand it because it's just not viable otherwise. Another is just general cross-sector convergence. Life science companies are starting to look at health technology, medical devices, precision medicines. And so you're starting to see a blending between both healthcare, life science types of delivery of therapeutics to higher precision and more prediction. And another area is just regulatory changes, reimbursement that's taking place. And another area is genomics and personalized medicine. So these are all major trends that are happening. And so from going back to your question on VCs and PE, private equity firms, they're looking at these types of both opportunities as well as kind of disruptive technologies that can be employed.
So you talk about these different trends, and you're talking about sort of a mix of people trying to break in and be disruptive, and I'm sort of broadly classifying this: people who are consolidating versus people who are disrupting. And I think you're seeing, you can break that down obviously into, as you have, about 8 different categories in the life sciences. Is there, everyone talks about the disruptive effects of AI. Let's pick on that just because that's where a lot of attention and interest is. I read a article yesterday that said we're in the middle of a recession for the most part, except for 5 companies who are driving all the change in the NASDAQ, for example, and the Dow. And I believe it's like Apple, Microsoft, Google, NVIDIA, and one of the A's, I forget which one. Well, it's probably Apple. But anyways, the point being, there is this push right now. Are we seeing technology becoming the core of how companies are being evaluated, and are companies going to live and die based on the technology that they actually have? Or is it now, or is traditional pharma still well and alive? And what I mean by that is your molecule is what matters, everything else is just frills.
It's I think it's all the above. Again, let's look at an example. The whole pharmaceutical side, the life science side, people are realizing that it isn't sufficient to have these large therapeutic opportunities, that with competition with generics, for the most part, 80% of therapies can be effective and safe using traditional, generic therapies. The question here is, how do you justify the higher premiums of something that is a novel therapy? And so companies are being challenged by insurers, P&T committees, to justify those premiums. So by definition, they're looking at ways in which they can employ more personalized or precision-based therapies, either in conjunction with traditional medications or in substitute of those medications. So you're looking at gene and other types of protein-specific therapies that you're starting to see employed. And one example is AstraZeneca recently purchased Alexion Pharmaceutical for $39 billion as a way of getting into immunotherapy and rare diseases. And so they're looking at going beyond the more traditional therapeutic delivery mechanisms into something that is more specific. And other areas might be, going back from a technology perspective, Microsoft recently purchased Nuance Communication so they can deliver speech recognition. And if you're looking at someone who may have, let's say, ALS, where it becomes important for them to come up with alternative ways of expressing themselves when they start to lose their ability to communicate, you see how they can have very specific use cases where this speech recognition and speech generation can be a very important enabler for a very targeted patient set. So that's, and then the other areas of looking at what United Healthcare, specifically their Optum, is interested in acquiring Change Healthcare. And that's another example where they're looking at coming up with ways in which they can actually change the paradigm of how healthcare insurers are actually working with healthcare providers by coming up with different value-based models. And so that's another example.
What I find fascinating about all of this is we traditionally, and maybe it's you and me, maybe it's just me who comes at it from the general big pharma is it's the biggest gorilla in the ring. So I tend to think of like big pharma trying to buy tech. What you pointed out is this interesting phenomenon of tech going into the medical device world, and we're seeing that obviously with Google in the space with Verily. You talked about Microsoft and the like. How do you think in those cases when you've got tech getting into pharma, have there been any early lessons for venture capitalists or for private equity companies where you're looking at these companies going, we come from the world of break quickly, move fast, into a world of regulation, into a world of move slowly, be precise, know that you're working with human lives? How do you bring those two together, and what risks does that present for your typical purchaser?
Yeah, I think two example when you mentioned regulation, the United Healthcare pending acquisition of Change Healthcare, that's been held up specifically around antitrust, and so DOJ is currently evaluating that. On the other hand, when it comes to use of your real world data is an example where even though real world data has been around for decades, the fact is that the regulatory agencies, FDA, EMA, have started to incorporate new guidance as a way of using real world data to generate real world evidence, especially when it comes to controls. So when you have studies, you can use this third-party data set to as evidence of understanding, let's say, the underlying prevalence or incidence of adverse events or serious adverse events associated with certain populations, and use that as a partial control. So the shift of the regulatory market has had a significant created a significant opportunity that just didn't exist just even a few years ago.
So now that we're seeing these new opportunities come around, let's get back to that original question we were talking about. Does it matter who is looking? If you are a private equity company versus a venture capital company, what I want to highlight is what are they looking for? Do private equities tend to look for more stable companies versus VCs looking for more disruptive companies, or is that usually a mix? And how does that play itself out?
Well, if you're dealing with private PE or VCs, by definition, these are private organizations. They're typically earlier stage. If they're a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company, clearly they are going to be either in the research or early clinical development. They're trying to show is there an addressable market based upon that particular mechanism of action in which they're able to demonstrate. They're also asking questions: is there reimbursement sufficient to justify the level of research that is required? And a good example of this is the whole antibiotic market. The United States and the world in general, we all recognize that the standard of care in terms of the antibiotics that we have available is really at risk, but yet the reimbursement of the next generation of antibiotics isn't sufficient to justify by the investments by PEs and VCs into that marketplace. And so it's been a real challenge, and that's been around for a long time. There has to be a shift in terms of being able to look at more effective reimbursement strategies, especially when it comes to areas where you have what could be significant threats to the healthcare as a result of not having effective therapies. So back to your question is, I don't think it really matters in terms of the category of private investors. It has a lot to do with in terms of where you are in the regulatory, in the life cycle of have you shown from a technical perspective, being able to technically demonstrate your particular, if it's a molecule, is it safe and effective, or you have a medical device, Are you in more market expansion where you're looking to have something that has technically been validated and they're looking at in terms of expanding into the marketplace, either just pre-market approval or post? And also, we're looking at this in terms of just purely from an investor standpoint. I think it's also looking at large pharmaceutical companies, large medical device companies are also investing in those companies early stage with specialty licensing, if it's around specific geographic rights, or being able to combine a particular therapy, novel therapy, maybe in conjunction with an existing therapy as a way of further differentiating themselves within the particular marketplace.
I kind of find a recent trend to be kind of interesting. This idea you're seeing, I don't know if it's existed before, but it's really spoken to me maybe in the last 4 months or so. You're seeing more and more publicly traded companies going private. Is that just my attention right now? It's just grabbing my attention because it's in the news right now, or is that also something you are seeing? Like it's a recent phenomenon, wasn't as common before.
I can come up with any specific examples. However, there is being a public company is a significant cost, and I think the general number is maybe 1% to 2% additional cost to be able to be a public company, and there's also, when you look at companies that are looking more longer term, whereas the public marketplace might be looking at shorter term returns, sometimes you have that conflict, and so you see some instances, I don't think many, in which companies decide that they want to be private, and they're able to have sufficient cash flow from their business operation, but maybe not sufficient types of earnings that would justify them to have a higher public evaluation. So I don't see that as necessarily a major trend, but you do see those every once in a while.
Yeah, it just grabbed my attention because of like Twitter, for example, being a big famous one recently. But I remember there was another recent one that made me go, huh, that's interesting. So sort of closing up the thoughts a little bit, if you were a big pharma looking to buy right now, one of the things you pointed to is the idea of reimbursement obviously playing a huge part. What are the other things that a purchaser would be looking for as they start evaluating what might be a good fit? And where should they start? Who should they be talking to? What evaluations would they be doing?
Again, you looking at companies that, if I'm a large pharma or any kind of large life science, I'm looking at maybe new therapeutic areas, or I might be looking at having new technology like gene therapies, or you might, so the example would be is Spark Therapeutics, a Philadelphia-based company who has, especially within cell and gene therapies, established a partnership when it comes to taking once they had the approval of their new therapy, they didn't have the economical scale and market reach basically to commercialize that. So they established a partnership with large pharma for that. As I mentioned before, AstraZeneca, acquisition of Alexion Pharmaceutical is an example where AstraZeneca wanted to get into rare diseases, an area in which they did not concentrate on. You see also in terms of just geographic, maybe someone has was able to commercialize within a particular geography, but they want to go into Europe or other types of markets. So they might have licensing arrangements, or they'll make an investment in the company as a way of having rights to the distribution of that. So again, it could be a combination of both technology, market, as well as just as a way of having economic scale, being able to commercialize a product that would otherwise would require a significant investment. And what we've seen in the last 18 months is, it has been a significant decline. I think there was upwards of about 600 M&A transactions per quarter several years ago, and it's dropped down to less than 400 in more recent years. And so those types of shifts is indicative of both the size of the market, but also I think the market itself is getting very conservative in terms of what is it going to actually take to achieve success. So they're being a little more rigorous in terms of aligning around expectations, and then being willing to actually pull the trigger on some of these mergers and acquisitions.
I'm going to ask one last question because, well, I can, and I'm lucky enough to have you to ask these questions. But one of the interesting things you noted as we were talking a few seconds ago was this. I would have thought, as someone who doesn't know anything, I would have thought that the place you go to is where you get the greatest returns, and the place you get the greatest returns are the underserved populations, if you will. And you pointed to a great example, this idea of antibiotics is a massive population that we know we need more help in, but the reimbursement just isn't there. Let me ask you this question: from a government perspective, from a VC perspective, a pharma perspective, what can the government do to make this process easier, to make investment into underserved needs better? So make it easier for companies to invest into, say, antibiotics.
Again, I'm not a regulatory expert, but if CMS or whomever would establish just like we did with COVID vaccines, saying we're going to go ahead and set a baseline demand in the United States, and say we will either establish a reimbursement level that's sufficient, or said that they will in itself guarantee a certain distribution of a new class of drugs. Is that something that's possible? So I think there's probably examples, or more recent examples with vaccines, that can show, because vaccines had some of the similar issues, because most vaccines, I believe, took probably upwards of a decade of clinical development, just because it wasn't a therapeutic, it was a vaccine that would prevent something, and so the threshold was much higher before introducing it into a naive population. There's probably examples using COVID to come up with these other areas. I mean, rare disease has some of the similar issues, and how do you kind of create demand when you only have 8,000 people with ALS every year, or you only have a few tens of thousands of people with Parkinson's every year? It's difficult to justify making those investments in a therapy that is just as complex, or if not more complex, than well-established diseases. And so there has to be a better way, beyond just greater market exclusivity. I mean, the other alternative is, extend the patent life for some of these diseases, which again, there are some exceptions in terms of how patents can be extended for some of these conditions. But maybe we need to look at, extending them further, so that there's a higher return on investment during those periods based upon the risk of development.
Wonderful. Jeffrey, before we go, how can people reach you if they have more questions?
Yes, the easiest way is go to our website. It's avancer.co, so AVANCER.co. We also have articles that we publish every month. Our most recent article is around M&A secrets, and what we identify are some of the typical reasons why companies fail executing on their M&A decisions, and what are some of the ways in which companies can mitigate those risks and hopefully improve their chance of success. So avancer.co is the best way of reaching us, as well as we're on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Jeffrey. Thank you for listening to this episode of Darshan Talks. Remember, the information we discuss is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice. For additional valuable insights and updates, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter at DarshanTalks.com. Darshan Talks is powered by the Kulkarni Law